Good morning. We are up to Chapter 7, Race and Ethnicity in Sport. As I said during last week's lecture, Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 cover some of the more controversial, polarizing, whatever you want to call it, topics. And we kind of continue that here with race and ethnicity in sport. Um, all right, so we're going to start with a little bit of background. I think it's important anytime you're having a discussion with someone, whether it is about race and ethnicity or whether it's about pretty much any topic, is that you understand the viewpoint from which they view or perceive the world around them. How do I describe or define viewing lens? Well, it's really how one sees the world based on their background, be it cultural history, be it their sexual identity, or their experiences, right? These things shape everything and inevitably lead to inherent biases. I personally try to be as objective as possible. I try to be aware of my biases that lead to the way I speak about things or the way I act about things. But again, it's important to understand how others view the world. So, having said that, this lecture is coming from the lens that I am mostly Hispanic. Despite being mostly Hispanic, I don't really identify as Hispanic. So, what does that mean? I'm not, super proud of my Puerto Rican heritage or anything like that. And it's not that I'm anti-Puerto Rican. It's just not something that I was kind of raised up with. Additionally, I was raised Catholic. I received my communion, confirmation, all of those things. But once again, despite those things, I definitely do not identify as Catholic. A few other things is absolutely grew up in a lower socioeconomic status household. I was the first generation college graduate. Neither my parents nor any of my grandparents graduated college. Again, that's just some general upbringing. Some other stuff that's not on this slide. I come from a high school that is very diverse, a nice mix of black, white, Hispanic, persons, and that's how I experienced the world growing up. Right? Ultimately, all of these things have led to me being generally liberal in some of my views and concepts. However, I always try to be as objective as possible in my discussions with people. So that's my background. So let's kind of in. So your text kind of starts with this quote, and I think it's interesting because of the way I talked about this chapter. Is the quote is most difficult of all sports communication terrains. And here's a difficult terrain on the right. I talked to my wife a lot about what I have to teach for the day, and we woke up this morning, and I said, "Oh, I get to my goal today for my lecture is to try not to get fired." And I'm serious. That's word for word what I said to my wife. And of course, I'm joking, but communication about race and ethnicity in any capacity is a very, very challenging terrain. We have to tiptoe, unfortunately, around these subjects, and I think it's important that kind of we kind of stay away from that tiptoeing, and we kind of have to just dive right in. Right, so here's some examples of where people have gotten into trouble, right? Because of their comments regarding race or ethnicity. So Kurt Schilling had some comments about Muslims and Nazis in 2015. Sure enough, he was later fired from ESPN in 2016 about his views on transgender athletes. Rachel Nichols, she wasn't directly fired, I don't think, from ESPN, but she was essentially pulled from ESPN coverage because she was had some comments about ESPN's diversity or commitment to diversity, and if you listen to the recording, Rachel Nichols didn't really say anything negative per se, and I definitely don't think of it as negative. She definitely wasn't racist. She was just very competitive, and she wanted to maintain her role with the ESPN, but her role was kind of being taken from her. And again, why it was being taken from her, again, that's a different story. But she was essentially pulled from ESPN. Now, the last person here, Donald Sterling, now this is overt or blatant racism. Those phone calls or recordings came out about him in, I want to say, I don't know, 2015, give or take, I don't remember off the top of my head, where he was blatantly racist. And sure enough, he was removed as an NBA owner. So I think it's, and we're going to get to this later on, some situations, yes, there is just overt and obvious racism, while some of these things might just be inappropriate, and other things might just be kind of just people speaking objectively, which I think is also important. So first, we have to understand that these are very, very complex conversations. Oftentimes, even during this lecture, I will simplify things to black and white, right? However, that is not always the case, right? A lot of what this is about is a in-group versus an out-group, a majority versus a minority, being empowered versus people who are less empowered, right? That's a lot of how these conversations kind of play out. But oftentimes, these conversations aren't even had, right? And like I said, there is a lot of tiptoeing. There's tiptoeing on the radio, there's tiptoeing on television, there's tiptoeing in the classroom when I have to give these lectures, and they're not spoken about because of fear. I mean, we've all heard cancel culture is a thing, and if somebody says something that maybe one person or one group disagree with, it can gain steam and it can lead to kind of the removal of someone from a job and affect their living. But as sad and unfortunate as those things may be, man, these conversations have to be had. They have to be had. Difficult conversations are part of a society and growing and evolution as a society, just like I said last week with when we talked about gender and their role in sports. All right, moving on to race versus ethnicity and how we kind of define these things. And I think this is interesting on how the textbook defines these things and kind of what's the difference between race and ethnicity. Interestingly enough, your text kind of defines it as race being a social construction, right? With ethnicity being more of a heritage or cultural based construction. And here's a quote from your text. And for this chapter, I do pull a lot of quotes, right? Race is when that population are believed to be naturally or biologically distinct from other populations. So, again, it's believed to be. It's the perception. It's that social construction, right? Here's a definition that I think is important, and that's the one-drop rule, where essentially if you have any non-white heritage, you are or can be considered a minority. And essentially when we're talking about race, what oftentimes happens is we are, as the book says, geared towards the visual. If somebody looks Hispanic, if somebody looks black, or if somebody looks the part of being white, they are more kind of defined in that sense. We look at these things in these just black and white. Instead, we don't really look at the gray. And when we look at the black and white, again, it's much more what we see than kind of what somebody is. And, a good example of this is someone like Tiger Woods, where Tiger Woods has a diverse cultural background, an ethnic background, but he's oftentimes viewed as black, right? And that's because that's what we see. So I think a few key moments for advancement in blacks in sports is very, very important. Despite, you'll hear me talk a lot about like what's going on today, we have to really appreciate for how much change has taken place in really a relatively short period of time, short being 100 years, give or take. The first sport which really started to be more inclusive of minorities, like black persons in sport, was boxing, right? Where in 1908, Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion of the world. This is really the first origins of the term Great White Hope, and we hear that all the time now. It's really in our common vernacular when a white person kind of ascends to a role that is dominated by a black person in sport. The quote-unquote Great White Hope. In 1936, this one, I personally, for me, because I'm a track guy, is one of my favorites, is Jesse Owens winning the 4 Olympic gold medals. And that was essentially a, U.S. versus Germany thing, and Adolf Hitler thinking the Aryan race is the dominant race. They are genetically superior to all other races. And it was a pretty cool time where Germany at the time really had this belief that Aryans were superior, and seeing it and witnessing it, and seeing Jesse Owens really dominate the Olympics in 1936 kind of debunked that, so to speak, and really changed uh, the zeitgeist, so to speak, of the time. Uh, One of the more common ones is Jackie Robinson being the first modern black MLB player, and not only that, but him being a great player. It's one thing if somebody's just breaking barriers, but it's another thing if someone is breaking barriers and being extremely successful, in which case he won the 1948 MVP. It's those things that I think can be even more impactful. Again, that's very similar to Jesse Owens. Some other ones, the 1966 Texas Western team winning an NCAA title with an all-black team versus an all-white team. This picture on the right is in the 1968 Olympics with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, really kind of raising their hands with the black gloves and no shoes on, in solidarity for black people. And then, that's, I think, some of the general history, and there's been many, many, many more instances of things like this in sports. I just listed a few people in modern times. Chris Paul, Kyrie Irving, LeBron James, Colin Kaepernick. I guess the question would be, and this also relates back to women in sports, do they have a responsibility? Right? Your assignment last week for women was, is it a hindrance if females are using their image, right, and kind of the sexual undertones to increasing their marketability, right? Is it a hindrance to the female gender? Okay, let's bring it here. Like, do black females have a responsibility to be more, I don't know, civically minded, right? To advance black participation in sports? Is it their responsibility? I talked last week also about Michael Jordan, how he's been relatively quiet. Your text talks about Steph Curry, how he's been relatively quiet on those fronts. Do they have a responsibility to use their platform, right, to increase awareness, to increase inclusion? I don't know. And I don't know. I can't say they do. I can't say they don't. Some people, it's not what they're interested in. For some people, that's not what I don't know, their personalities lend themselves to. Some people might be an introvert. I don't know. What do you guys think? Sports selection and participation, highly segregated. And we often think, oh, the U.S., things have changed. But if you kind of look at the numbers, no, we really are highly segregated. And some of it's intentional, some of it's not intentional, right? But in reality, there's basically self-selection based on your geographic location, your culture, and your financial means, and kind of the mix of all three of these things. What are your first thoughts? What are your first thoughts when you envision a dominant Olympic gold winning black swimmer, right? What about a dominant, again, Olympic gold winning Asian sprinter, right? What do you think when you see or hear about a very dominant white running back? Right? Are these things you can envision, or do you struggle with these things? Right? For some of us, we struggle kind of envisioning and understanding these things, and this is called cognitive dissonance. Right? This is the clashing of thoughts with regard to expectation and reality. Right? The example I has is it's hard to envision a dominant Asian basketball player because the stereotype is that Asian persons are of relatively short stature, right? And that's all those examples I put forth earlier. It is hard for us because we expect, right? We expect sprinters to, by and large, because of stereotypes, be black. We expect quarterbacks in the NFL, although that is changing. We expect quarterbacks to be by and large white, and envisioning, right, someone of or having reality be different causes an actual stress in our kind of thought processes. So that's essentially what cognitive dissonance is. Participation and coaching rates. And this is where things can be really evident. I'm a numbers guy, right? You can see it, right? If you look at where is it most evident? Well, I mean, participation rates have definitely improved, but by and large, the MLB is predominantly white and Hispanic with a extremely low African American percentage. But look at the NBA, right? And the NFL and the WNBA, right? All of them 70% African American, and then extremely low Hispanic and Asian, right? Where I think this becomes, I don't know, more controversial, right? The people who have control, right, are the higher ups, right? Like who controls these NBA teams? The coaches, and you'll see we'll go above the coaches in a little bit, but you can see, despite the NBA and the NFL being predominantly African American, right, coaching roles across the board are predominantly held by white Americans, right? 87% in the the MLB, 70% in the NBA, right? And people would argue that, I mean, this is not representative of their populations. It's probably not representative of not only the people participating, but it's also not representative of the people that are consuming the sports as well. So I think you can see that there is a cause for change, right? There is a potential need for change, and that's one of your assignments that we'll get to it here. Societal undertones for change. Here's another quote, and this is actually from a research paper. Institutional racism continues to prevent African Americans from rising to various coaching, administrative, and ownership positions. Despite that, I think it's important for us to understand that change does not come easy. Money, right, in this country, really in the world, leads to power, which inevitably leads to decision-making processes or just decisions, right? There's over 3,000 billionaires in the world. In the United States, there's approximately 800, 900 billionaires, depending on the year, right? Of the 3,000 billionaires, there is approximately 15, of which I think this number is a little bit higher, maybe 20, 25, 30. 30 are black. So you can see that if there are 3,000 billionaires in the world and there are only let's say 20 to 30, right? Decisions and powers, I talked earlier about the empowered versus the less empowered, right, are going to come from predominantly white or, another source of the major source of billionaires, Asian populations, right? Now, this is more globally. If we kind of bring this down a little bit and start looking more at sports, let's look at NFL ownership, right? NFL ownership is 95% white. There is not a single black majority owner in the NFL, right? And then if we trickle this down, and I don't know what the current number is in terms of black head coaches in the NFL, but Tomlinson is one that comes to mind. But we know that the vast majority of head coaches in the NFL are white. So the NFL instituted in 2002 something called the Rooney Rule, where teams have to interview at least one minority for a head coach and front office position. I don't want to talk about the Rooney Rule too much. I do think the Rooney Rule was good-natured and well intended, but there are some inherent issues with the Rooney Rule, one of which was a Brian Flores lawsuit against the NFL, which most recently came out. There are things that can be done to kind of improve this, but the whole point of this slide is really to see that we're trying to make changes, but at the end of the day, it doesn't come easy and it doesn't come fast. Okay. All right. Okay. Media dialogues. As we kind of started with these slides, it's a very, very challenging terrain. I think when you're having conversations, it is important to identify what is blatant racism versus inappropriate comments versus simply objective points that, like, again, some people might find offensive, but if we just look at what we know, the objective data kind of plays itself out, and just because I'm saying something or somebody is saying something doesn't mean it's a display of racism, right? And so what are some examples of this? Um, a QB example. A QB example. I'm trying to think of what I wanted here. Um, if a broadcaster or a coach, right, said a black person cannot play quarterback because it is a position of intelligence, that is an example clearly of blatant racism, right, and not really acceptable whatsoever. Okay. However, right, there's other examples of just things that are inappropriate on the radio all the time, right? I listen to ESPN radio on my way into work, right? I will hear examples, and ESPN has done a great job of improving cultural diversity in the workplace. There are black people and white people on the radio together, and it's funny, right? Because I'll hear them make comments about being black versus white. I'll hear radio announcers saying like, "Oh, if in basketball a white person, I don't know, dunks on a black person, they'll make a joke about it on the radio." Right? This is probably an inappropriate comment, and depends on how far they take it, right? But kind of where do we draw the line is my next point. Is sometimes these things are just on cultural or historical perspectives, and sometimes they just try to be funny, right? This is kind of, I guess, the argument against cancel culture. Sometimes people are just simply trying to be funny, and sometimes funny is based on inappropriate comments, right? Where do we draw the line? I don't know. Not clear cut. Obviously, overt, clear racism is something we have to draw the line on. But what about like the gray areas, right? If a black person on the radio says something about bringing someone over for, I don't know, to help cook fried chicken, and I've heard this as an example, right? But what if a white person says something like that? Inappropriate. Probably inappropriate, correct? So something to think about where we draw the line. Obviously, just speaking objectively about data, right, is something that should be accepted, where if we're having conversations about moving the needle here, yeah, by and large, quarterbacks tend to be white. By and large, running backs tend to be black. Or if we're looking at baseball, by and large, pitchers tend to be white. Right? This is just objective data that should be accepted in normal day-to-day conversations, or even writings within something like Sports Illustrated, or even commentary on sports media. I'll tell you right now, on the television, they avoid those conversations, probably because some people don't want to be uncomfortable, and the consumer probably doesn't want to hear about it. But again, I guess it depends on the platform from where you're speaking from. All right, last slide before we get to your assignment. Magic bullet theory and cultivation theory. Magic bullet theory is also called hypodermic needle theory, where essentially media messages are injected into the public's conscious, and we can manipulate their thoughts and actions. And one of the general premises of magic bullet theory are that people and the public are passive and very gullible. And I would argue, to an extent, some people are very gullible, right? While this has been a little bit, I wouldn't say debunked, there's been a newer theory called cultivation theory, which is the subconscious power of media. And essentially, the attitudes and behaviors of people can be changed because of prolonged exposure to content on media. Your thoughts, your actions over time can change because of what you are exposed to, whether it's social media, which is very, very powerful. And this is one of the criticisms of Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, right? If they are not filtering, right, if they are not filtering their content, or we have, what is it? I don't know, like Facebook's like AI system, which kind of gears content towards someone. If you consume certain things, Facebook's going to direct more content to that towards your screen, so to speak, right? if that continuously is bombarded to you, right, that is going to continuously shape your thoughts. And I see it, guys. I see it. I see people kind of being cultivated. I see people who follow like super liberal platforms, super conservative platforms, and they're getting exposed to more and more conservative viewpoints or more and more liberal viewpoints, and they become more extreme in their thoughts. So, it's something that I think is a major issue with social media nowadays. And you could start to see it where the government is starting to think, all right, maybe some of this does need to be regulated. All right, investigate and report. So what I would like you guys to do for your assignment this week is look into the Rooney Rule, right? I think the Rooney Rule is a very good topic for that kind of, I don't know, covers the majority of this chapter, the overview of this chapter, right? I have an article. I'll link it on Blackboard. Read the article. And really what I want you to do in a PDF or in a Word document is answer these questions, right? Again, PDF or Word. Describe the Rooney Rule. Why was the Rooney Rule enacted? How has the Rooney Rule impacted hirings? Has there been any critics of the Rooney Rule? Yes, there has. It's not a perfect rule. Again, it was well intended, but it is not perfect. I want you to provide one story, and they're all over the internet, right? Provide one story and their criticisms of the Rooney Rule. Provide a link to the story. There should be a link. And then finally, the rest should be your opinion. What can be done to improve the Rooney Rule? That is it for today. Hopefully you guys don't think I should be fired based on this discussion, and we take it from there. We go into chapter 8 next week.